In this lecture, we're going to spend some more time with sounds. And what we're going to see is based on the fact that now you understand that the actual sounds of language are quite different from the way we transcribe them onto paper or print them on paper. And now that you understand that the sounds in a language are related in ways that the arbitrary sequence of the alphabet cannot indicate and does not indicate. And so, armed with that, you're in a position to understand that one of the most basic aspects of the way we generate language, and today we're going to see this on the level of sound, we'll see it in other ways later, is that there is what's called an underlying form, and then there's a surface form. There are two levels, an original foundational level, and then there's what happens when we actually present what we want to say to the world. This is called, in linguistics, the difference between the phonemic and the phonetic. And so let me give you a sense of what I mean. The basic insight here is that what comes out on the surface is often quite different from the way the brain originally generates it. So let's take the words in English bat and pat. They are obviously different words. What makes the difference is that bat begins with B and pat begins with P. But that is not the relationship between B and P in all languages. Let's take a language which is not English, such as Korean. In Korean, there are no words that begin with B. There are no words that end with B. And in fact, in the mind of a Korean speaker, there is no quote-unquote letter B. That's not there. Now, if you listen to a Korean talking, you would hear buzz here and there. However, it's a different kind of b than our b. In Korean, b is just something that happens to p depending on where p happens to be in the word. To be more specific, b is something that happens to p when p happens to fall between two vowels. Now, here's what I mean. There is a word in Korean, pup. That means law. Now, notice, if you see pup on the screen, that the vowel is a schwa. Now, if we were just using ordinary spelling, how in the world would we write pup? And however we chose to write it, with a U or something else, we'd have to explain it to whoever we were writing this for. There'd have to be an informal agreement. Now, one of the uses of the IPA is that we can have this sound, which in Korean plays a different role than it does in English, and we can just write pup, and there it is. There'd be no way to write it in English where everybody would understand. So, in any case, the word law is pup. Now, just like in English, there are prefixes and suffixes in Korean that will change the, if we will, part of speech of a word. And so the word for law is pup. And then the word for lawlessness involves putting a prefix on the word, and it happens to be mu. We don't have to worry about the details. But you say law, and then if you want to say lawlessness, then you would think you would say mu pup, like this. However, in fact, the word is not mu pup. And that's because there is this rule in Korean. Whenever a p winds up between two vowels, then it becomes a b. Now, that's not so counterintuitive, we know now, because it used to be that in this primordial era, we thought of B and P as where they are in the alphabet. But now we know P and B are both bilabial stops. They are only different in terms of the fact that P is voiceless and B is voiced. So these sounds are like two peas in a pod. And so P changes to something when it's between two vowels. And what it changes to, rather predictably, is its voiced counterpart. And so you've got this B in there. So what this means is that in Korean, B is just something that happens to P sometimes. It's just something that happens kind of later in the process. There's no word bup. That would never happen. It would be pup. The P only changes to B when there's a vowel before it. And so mu bup. And that means that in Korean, B is not a real sound. P is a real sound. B is just something that happens to P sometimes. And even when Korean writes mupup, it writes the B sound with a P because the real word under there is pup. And to them, mubup is just the way that you pronounce mupup. And so B is just something that happens to P. There is no real B. Now take that from Korean and mentally put that aside. And now we're going to look at a different case which complements it, and then I'll bring these things together to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Let's use English. Say pot and then say spot. Now in both cases, you've got a P. But when you say pot, if you put your hand in front of your face, you feel a puff, pot. If you say spot, you don't feel that puff, or you feel much less of one. Don't be too explicit, the way you really say it. Pot, spot. So there are two different ways of saying P. Now, when you say it with the puff, as in pot, what you're doing, it has a term. It's called aspiration. And so that's an aspirated version of a P. Now, that kind of P, the kind of puffy P, that only happens when the P is at the beginning of a word or at the beginning of a syllable, like in capacity. That's where that occurs. And so there are actually two kinds of P's. There's P and there's P. We don't usually say it in isolation, but there's the P that's in spat. Spat doesn't have a puff. So there's puffy P and puffless P. P and P. Now, we don't think of P and P as different sounds. Rather, P and P are two different ways of saying P. It's not as if we could have P and P making the difference in meaning between two words like P and B, P and B do with pat and bat. It's not as if a bat is something that you hit a ball with and a pat is something you get on the head and a pat is something that you scramble with your eggs. There's no such thing as a pat. That wouldn't happen. Rather, P is just something that happens to P when it comes at the beginning of a word or a syllable. But, however, this is the thing. In Korean, P and P are real sounds. And what I mean by that is that they make the difference in the meanings of a word. And so, for example, in Korean, pul means grass. Now that's a puffy P, but it's not puffy because it's at the beginning of a word. Pul means grass, but hul means fire. Watch that again or listen to it. Pul means grass. Hul means fire. Completely different words. And so that means that both P and P are different real sounds in Korean. Now remember we saw that B is not a real sound. B is just what happens when P gets caught between two vowels. They don't even use it in their alphabet. But then we do not have any indication of the puffiness of P in our alphabet. It's just that you sometimes say P, sometimes you say P, and it depends on where the P happens to be, and you can be pardoned for probably never having thought about that before. But in Korean, they'll think about it. They'll tell you. People who are not linguists know that there is P and there's P. And they have to know because when they say a word like pool, they mean grass. And then if somebody says pool, well, that means something completely different, fire. If you've ever had any experience with Korean and noticed that it's very hard to get things across to native speakers without either being laughed at or getting things wrong or having to make many repetitions, a lot of it is because of these aspects of the consonants. We think of P and P as the same thing. In my head, they certainly are. But to them, if you say pool, it's one thing. If you say pool, it's another. If you say tool, it's one thing. If you say tool, it's another. And so they are real sounds. Now, what this means is that in a language, as we've seen, there is a grid of sounds. But there's more to a language's collection of sounds than just that they're all in there. There's a certain relationship. In each language, some sounds are real sounds. And that means that they can make the difference between words' meanings. And so bat and pat, B and P are real sounds for us. Pool and pool, P and P are real sounds in Korean. Whereas there are other sounds that just arise as the product of some other sound, depending on where that sound happens to be in a word. So, In linguist terms, the real sounds are called phonemes. Now, phoneme is not just a synonym for a sound. Phoneme is the real sound. In Korean, there is no phoneme B, because B is just something that happens to P when it gets caught between two vowels. It's a regular process, but it's not thought of as a real sound. It's not a phoneme. In English, P as opposed to P is not a phoneme. It's a sound. P and B are both sounds, but the phonemes are P and B. Now, any phoneme has variations. And so, for example, in English, there is what we can think of as the grand concept of P. There's something which you could call P-itude. It's the grand conception of P. I was once trying to explain this to a class and made up a word by accident that really got me in a little trouble. P-itude. Now, we have two kinds of P-itude. You have puffy P, and then you've got kind of boring P, non-puffy P. And so you've got pot P and spot P. Now, those are variations on P. Those two kinds of P, the pot P and the spot P, what we call them are allophones of the phoneme P. So P is a phoneme. It's a real sound, but it comes in variations, and those are called allophones. So it has allophones. That's how it works in English. Now, over in Korean, things are different. And so P and P are phonemes. They make the difference in the meaning of a word. But there's no such thing, for example, as boop. You have poop, and that's law, but then there's no boop. B only happens when it gets caught between two vowels. And so there is a phoneme in Korean, and that phoneme is B. That's the spot P for us. It's the non-puffy P. And it comes in two variations. You either have B, and that's, for example, at the beginning of the word poop, law. And then you've got B. And that's what happens when this phoneme P, not aspirated P, but P, happens to come between two vowels. And so B in Korean is just a type of P. B is just one of two allophones I'm showing you of non-puffy P. Then over here, you've got puffy P, and that is a whole different phoneme. And so here you can see on the screen what this relationship is. And so there are different things that a language can do with its B-ness, so to speak. There are different things a language can do with its P-itude. There's a grand concept of P, and you might think of it as a capital letter P, and it has allophones. There are types of P. In English, P and P are variations of P. In Korean, those same two variations are actually separate sounds. You can think of a capital P and then a capital aspirated P. And we don't have to worry about the allophones of aspirated P, but capital P, there are two variations, just ordinary B, and that's non-aspirated, non-puffy P, and then B. And so that's how that works. So there are phonemes and there are allophones. Now, to give you a little bit of transcriptional detail, in terms of phonemes, we put phonemes in slashes in linguistics. And so if we're talking about the phoneme P, if we're talking about grand poobah P-itude, then we put the P in slashes. Allophones go in brackets. And so if we're talking about, for example, puffy P in English, which is really just one kind of P-itude, then we put that in brackets. Now, you can do transcription. And so on the phonemic level, in terms of what the succession of grand real sounds are, then if you are going to transcribe the word pot, well, it's just good old P-A-T. In slashes, you just have P-A-T, like so. However, if you're going to talk about the phonetic transcription, that is not what is the first thing that you put together in your mind, but how you happen to pronounce it, then you indicate that that P, because it's at the beginning of the word, is pronounced as a certain allophone of P-itude. And in this case, because it's at the beginning of the word, it gets what we call aspirated. You can call it puffified, but therefore you have pot. And when you put that in brackets, that's the way the word is actually pronounced. We think of the phonemic transcription as the way the word is generated initially. And so there is this level of the phonemic versus the phonetic. The phonemic form is called the underlying form because it is the original. That's thought of as the substrate. The phonetic form is called the surface form. That's what happens when you actually produce the word, when you, as it were, put it out to the surface. In the same way, the word for lawlessness on the phonemic or the underlying level is mu-boop. And so you have the P there because the P at first is just put there on some level mentally. The phonetic form, the surface form is, and this is what you put in brackets, mu-boop. That's where you show that when a nice unsuspecting P happens to be between two vowels, it has a voice put into it. I can put it that way. It becomes a voiced bilabial stop. That's what happens because vowels, if you think about it, to take you into this a little further, vowels are voiced. You know, when a vowel has a voice, that is a voiced thing. There's no, for our purposes, voiceless vowels. And so the P ends up being a little bit more like what it's surrounded by, and it takes on a voice, and it becomes mu-boop. That's something that you indicate as having happened as the word was generated, as we put it, from underlying to surface. And so you've got underlying form and surface form. That's how language works. There's something going on underneath, and then there's something that actually happens on the surface, and there can be differences between them. So there's the phonemic level and the phonetic level, and this is something which happens throughout grammar on different levels, as we'll see, to the point where there are linguists who talk about just emic and etic. Those are words that have been derived from the original concepts of phonemic and phonetic. Emic is underlying. Etic is what happens to the underlying material when it is pummeled about by things such as sounds wanting to be more like each other, or any number of things. This emic versus etic issue also ties into how language changes, as we'll see. But you understand now, I hope, that there is a basic conception, which is that there is a grand concept of, for example, P. That's your phoneme, the real sound. And then there are ways that the P can be pronounced. And that varies. And the way that sort of thing varies with each sound in a language means that there is a difference between what P versus P means in a language. There's a difference between what B versus P will mean in a language. Varies with the sound sets of each language. Now let me show you another example of how what's going on the bottom can be different from what's going on the top. Let's think about the English plural. And so we have these various words, and we're told, based on writing, that the plural marker in English is S. And that's because that's what we see on the page. And it's perfectly natural to think that that's what's going on. But have you ever noticed that actually, not just some of the time, but most of the time, this supposed S is pronounced as Z. I mean, think about it. You've got your cards, pigs, fans, hams, hogs. There's no way you would say hogs. That's not what the plural marker is. You have one ham. That's, nice. Now, if you have more than one ham, do you say hams? That's not even a word of English. You say hams. It's a Z, really. It's a Z most of the time. You've got a house, and then you have houses. No, you have houses. In fact, you only pronounce the plural marker with an S in a certain case. And so, for example, think about it. Caps, cats, hacks, coughs, moths. Now, you would not say, for example, cads, like cats. That doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't say for hacks, hacks. You can't, really. And so you say hacks. Now, this is giving you a hint as to what's actually going on. The plural marker in English is not S. Whatever determined that it was written that way in writing a very, very long time ago when the language was actually at a different stage. In English, as we speak it now, the plural marker in the real sense is Z. That's what it is most of the time. After vowels, for example, I have an auto. You know, if you think about it, auto is barely a valid word in modern English. Let's choose something else. I have a chimpanzee. Hate them. They wear diapers. They throw things. I was on a TV show once with a chimpanzee. I was very, very uncomfortable. It was Dennis Miller. The show was off. Anyway, so chimpanzee. You would never say chimpanzees. You say chimpanzees. And if you think about it, that's after all vowels. You go to many venues, and you don't go to venues, etc. So that's the way that works. And really, it's only just a few consonants. And if you look at, say, caps, cats, hacks, coughs, it is what we now know are voiceless consonants. So the plural marker in English is a nice, lovely Z. It is a lovely voiced alveolar fricative. Now, in certain cases, it becomes S. That is when it happens to come after a voiceless consonant, such as caps, such as cats, such as hacks. In those three words, I'm giving you our original classic top three voiceless consonants, P, T, and K. Those should be imprinted in your head one day because they have that kind of relationship. Those are our bilabial, our alveolar, and our velar voiceless stops. And so cap, cat, hacks, well, you say caps. So the Z becomes a voiceless alveolar fricative. Remember, S and Z are in that relationship because the Z ends up being more like the consonant that comes before it. That's something that happens all the time in the way we produce language and the way language changes. And so underlyingly, it's Z. In terms of cases where the plural marker comes out as S, that's after. That's something that's kind of ex post facto. That's something that only happened as the result of a process after the plural marker was put on. So think of it this way. You're in your head, you know, as if we aren't always, but you're in someone else's head and you're watching a word being generated. You know, you can imagine what our thoughts might be. And so you've got a cap. You're somebody who runs around wearing a cap. And then for some reason you want to talk about the concept of cap in the plural, which I think is rare. But let's imagine that you wanted to talk about more than one cap. And so, well, the plural marker, here it is, it's Z. And so you've got cap and you've got Z, and you're going to put them together. Well, the fact is that cap and Z don't go together gracefully because you'd have to say cabz. They don't fit because P is voiceless and Z is voiced. Those two things don't go together. So what happens is that at one point there's cap and Z. There's cap stored in your brain somewhere and there's Z stored in your brain somewhere. When you bring them together, you have to do something to make it a legitimate word in English, and that is that you have to make that lovely voiced sound voiceless because it's going to be coming right after one. So you start with cap. It's in your hand. You've got the Z. Imagine it in your hand. Think, for those of you who've been around a certain amount of time, remember back to Sesame Street, or actually, you're watching it with your kids. Imagine them as physical objects. Now you're going to put cap and Z together, but that doesn't work. Z has to be fixed. And so it becomes this S sound. And so caps. So that means that there's an underlying form of the plural marker, which is Z. And then, now and then, you have this surface form of it, which is S, which only happens because of where it happens to be, what kind of sound it happens to be next to. And in the same way, pot begins as pots, and that's hopeless in English, and so it comes out on the surface as pots. So there's this difference between underlying and surface. So the study of how speakers generate words in this way, in terms of how speakers generate sounds in this way, is called phonology. Careers are made on it. And the basic assumption in phonology is that the underlying form is different from the surface form, often very different, and charting what the rule is as to how you get from the underlying to the surface can be much more difficult than figuring out that a voiceless consonant gets a voice when it's between two voices or vowels, so to speak. Or even something a little trickier, which is that the real plural marker must be Z because it appears everywhere else and that it becomes a S. Sometimes these things get much more complex, and that's what phonologists do. But to give you a sense, and I think this is really, really fun. I want to share this with you. To give you a sense of how allophones work, and the fact that allophony, so to speak, is really central to how we express sounds, i.e. these things that are often represented by one letter of the alphabet. I want to show you something with the word oil. Now, what is oil? Now, before we started this set, we thought of oil as something that's spelled with letters, O-I-L, okay? Well, now we know that it's actually, there are actually only 3 symbols that we need, or depending on what you want to call it, 2, if you call the diphthong 1. And so what we have is our sound for all. This is the quote-unquote backwards C, and we have a diphthong, and so we have the J symbol, which is the glide, and so oil, and then we have an L. And so there you go. Now, that really is just the underlying, the phonemic representation of how an English speaker actually says oil. And that's because actually there are allophones of L. And so, for example, take the word lateral. I think I'm saying lateral the way most American English speakers say lateral. But really, there's a difference between the first L and the final L. Because if there weren't, if you think about it, what I'd be saying is lateral, because I'm saying let's isolate it. So I'm doing this nice, clean L, this L that flips gracefully into the A. That's what we all do. La, 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 la. Okay, so lateral. I'm not doing that. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating this little come off, but even so, lateral. No, that's not what I'm doing. The L at the end is actually rather different. In fact, the L at the end of lateral, the way we really say it, is actually pretty much a vowel. It's lateral. Oh, hear that? And so, in the same way, the L in oil is not what we think of as an L. Nobody, after all, says oil, oil. It's not the same L as at the beginning of, say, liquid. There are allophones of L-ness, of elitude. There's the one that you use at the beginning of a word or a syllable, and so that's the L one, and I think in all of our heads that's real L, partly because it's at the beginning, etc. But when L happens in other places, then you're really getting a different kind of thing, and that includes at the end of a word. And so, I will tell you that if you run the word oil uttered the right way, if you utter it in a very ordinary way, if you run the word oil backwards on a tape, then it sounds exactly like oil. It's bizarre. Now, you'd think that, like, let's start with the spelling. You'd think that oil run backwards would sound like Leo, right? Because that's the spelling, but obviously not. But even if we allow that what oil is the diphthong oi and then L, you might think that if you ran it backwards, it would be something like Leo or something like that. And you know, it isn't. It really isn't. And I'm going to prove that to you. We're going to listen right now to the word oil said by a perfectly normal person. And he's saying it forward. And then we're going to run it backwards. And I swear to you that this is not a trick, that this is really the way it came out. So here is the word oil said by a standard American English speaker, unintoxicated, not very long ago. Here's how he said it. He said it repeated times.
Oil, 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 oil.
And now, listen to the same guy at the same time saying the word, but run backwards. The tape is run backwards. This isn't him saying it backwards. This is the tape run backwards.
Oil, 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 oil.
It's quite remarkable, or not, because actually the way you say L at the end of a word, all, is really more or less all. And so oil, if we can get the peskiness of letters out of our heads, is really rather like saying oil. That's what you're saying. There's a slight difference, but the difference is so slight that if you run somebody saying oil backwards, it comes out as oil. You know, sounding not particularly like a Martian or somebody with brain damage, and that's because there is an allophone of L at the end of words. So, with that demonstration, that is remarkable, isn't it? I know it's quite jarring at first. I've gotten over it. But now that we have seen that, then we understand that there's a difference between the underlying and the surface, and that's a theme that we'll see again. But thank you for coming with me through the world of sounds.